In the year 9 of the Common Era, deep within the shadowy depths of a German forest, the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever known was about to meet its darkest hour. 3 entire Roman legions, 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, would march into a trap so perfectly conceived that it would echo through history as one of the most devastating military disasters ever recorded. This is the story of the Teutoburg forest ambush, where cunning strategy, brutal terrain, and calculated betrayal converged to destroy the pride of the Roman Empire in a massacre that would haunt Augustus Caesar for the rest of his days. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must first grasp what Rome had become by the dawn of the 1st century. The Roman Empire stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the olive groves of Spain to the mountains of Armenia. Roman legions had crushed every enemy they encountered, their disciplined formations and superior tactics making them seemingly invincible. The eagle standards of Rome flew over conquered peoples across 3 continents, and the very name of Rome struck fear into the hearts of barbarian chieftains from Germania to Gaul. Under Emperor Augustus, Rome's expansion had reached unprecedented heights. The civil wars that had torn the Republic apart were a distant memory, replaced by an era of conquest and consolidation. Augustus had transformed Rome from a city-state into the master of the Mediterranean world, and his legions stood ready to push the boundaries of civilization even further. The Rhine River had long served as the natural frontier between the Roman provinces and the wild Germanic tribes beyond, but Augustus harbored grander ambitions. He envisioned a Roman Germania, stretching eastward to the Elbe River, bringing order and civilization to the fractious barbarian tribes. The architect of this vision was Drusus, Augustus's stepson, a brilliant general who had carved his way through Germanic territory with methodical precision. Drusus created 2 mighty armies stationed along the Rhine, one for the lower regions called Germania Inferior, and another for the middle territories known as Germania Superior. His campaigns were legendary, crushing tribe after tribe as he advanced deeper into the German heartland. The Sicambri, the Cherusci, the Suebi, all fell before the disciplined might of his legions. By the time of his death in 9 BCE, Drusus had pushed Roman control as far as the Elbe River, subjugating a vast territory that Rome collectively called Germania Magna. Following Drusus's death, the task of administering this conquered territory fell to Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man chosen by Augustus himself and bound to the imperial family through marriage to the emperor's grandniece. Varus was no ordinary general. He commanded 5 full legions plus auxiliary forces, a staggering military presence of some 25,000 soldiers, representing nearly 20% of Rome's entire frontline army. Each legion at full strength consisted of approximately 5,000 fighting men, battle-hardened veterans who had proven themselves in campaigns across the empire. These were not mere soldiers, but the finest military force the ancient world had ever assembled. Yet Varus was fundamentally different from his predecessor. Where Drusus had been a warrior born, Varus was an administrator by nature. He possessed the political acumen and bureaucratic skills necessary to transform conquered territory into a functioning Roman province, but he lacked the instinctive understanding of warfare that had made Drusus so formidable. More critically, Varus failed to comprehend the Germanic temperament or appreciate the warlike nature of the tribes he now governed. The Romans had grown accustomed to their overwhelming superiority, confident that their disciplined formations and tactical brilliance would easily subdue any scattered resistance. This overconfidence blinded them to a danger brewing in their very midst. Among the Germanic auxiliary forces serving under Varus was a young chieftain of the Cherusci tribe named Arminius. Born around 18 BCE as the eldest son of Chief Segima, Arminius had been raised in Rome itself, likely surrendered as a child hostage to secure peace between his tribe and the empire. This was a common Roman practice, taking the sons of conquered chieftains and raising them as Romans, hoping to create a generation of leaders who would convince their people of Roman superiority. The strategy had worked perfectly, or so it seemed. Arminius learned to speak Latin fluently, received a Roman military education, and was granted both Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. He served with distinction in the Roman army between 1 and 6 CE, fighting alongside legions under Tiberius during the brutal suppression of the Pannonian and Illyrian revolts. His knowledge of Roman politics and military tactics was comprehensive, allowing him to anticipate enemy battle maneuvers and coordinate complex military operations. Around 4 CE, He assumed command of a Cheruscan detachment of Roman auxiliary forces, proving himself a capable and trusted officer. To all outward appearances, Arminius embodied the success of Roman cultural imperialism. He had been transformed from a barbarian hostage into a Roman citizen, from a tribal warrior into an officer in the most powerful army on earth. His younger brother Flavus had followed a similar path, and both brothers seemed living proof that Germanic peoples could be successfully integrated into Roman civilization. Varus trusted Arminius completely, relying on his knowledge of local terrain and tribal politics to maintain order in the newly conquered province. But beneath this veneer of Roman loyalty, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Arminius had not forgotten his origins, and the harsh methods employed by Varus to Romanize the Germanic tribes stirred deep resentment in his heart. The governor's demands for taxes, his rough-handed treatment of tribal leaders, and his assumption that Germanic peoples were inferior beings to be molded into Roman subjects created a growing well of anger among the Cherusci and their neighbors. Varus's administrative approach, so effective in governing settled provinces, proved disastrously inappropriate for dealing with proud warrior tribes who valued their independence above all else. As Arminius watched his countrymen suffer under Roman rule, a transformation began that would alter the course of European history. The Roman citizen and auxiliary commander started to see himself once again as a Germanic chieftain, bound by blood and honor to his people's ancient ways. His Roman education became not a symbol of cultural advancement, but a weapon to be turned against his former masters. Every tactical lesson he had learned, every weakness in Roman military doctrine he had observed, every detail of legionary organization and battlefield procedure became part of an emerging plan that was breathtaking in its audacity and scope. The transformation from Roman ally to Germanic liberator represents one of history's most dramatic reversals of loyalty, but it was not a decision made in haste or anger. Arminius understood that open rebellion would be suicidal. The Roman forces stationed along the Rhine were too powerful to challenge in direct battle, their defensive positions too strong to assault, their supply lines too well protected to sever. Any conventional uprising would be crushed as swiftly and brutally as Drusus had crushed the previous generation of Germanic resistance. If Arminius was to succeed where others had failed, he would need to think like a Roman while fighting like a Germanic warrior, using deception and cunning to lure the legions away from their fortifications and into terrain where their advantages would become liabilities. The plan that began to form in Arminius's mind was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. He would use his position as a trusted Roman auxiliary commander to convince Varus that a rebellion had broken out in northern Germania, far from the Rhine fortifications. The Roman response would be predictable, a show of force designed to crush the uprising quickly and decisively. Varus would march his legions into the German interior, confident in their ability to handle whatever resistance they encountered, and there, in the deep forests where Roman formations could not deploy effectively, where their heavy equipment would become a burden rather than an advantage, Arminius would spring his trap. The execution of this grand deception required meticulous planning and extraordinary diplomatic skill. Arminius could not act alone. The Germanic tribes had spent generations fighting each other as much as they had fought Rome, their ancient feuds and territorial disputes preventing any unified resistance. To succeed, Arminius would need to forge an alliance among peoples who had been enemies for centuries, convincing them to set aside their differences and unite under his leadership. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his entire strategy, requiring him to become not just a military commander, but a visionary leader capable of inspiring tribes across Germania to risk everything for freedom. Working in absolute secrecy, Arminius began reaching out to chieftains throughout the region. His Roman rank and reputation gave him access to tribal leaders who might otherwise have been suspicious of any alliance proposal. He spoke to them in their own languages, about their shared heritage, their common grievances against Roman rule, and the opportunity that now presented itself. The Cherusci were his natural allies, bound to him by blood and tribal loyalty, but he also needed the support of the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Chatti, and dozens of smaller tribes scattered across the Germanic territories. Each conversation was a delicate negotiation, fraught with danger. If even one chieftain betrayed his plans to the Romans, Arminius would face immediate execution as a traitor, and his entire conspiracy would collapse. Yet somehow, through a combination of personal charisma, shared resentment against Roman oppression, and carefully crafted promises of future autonomy, he managed to build a coalition unlike anything Germania had ever seen. Warriors who had spent their lives raiding each other's cattle and burning each other's villages now swore oaths of brotherhood in the cause of driving Rome back across the Rhine. The scale of coordination required was staggering. Thousands of warriors needed to be positioned throughout the Teutoburg forest without alerting Roman patrols or spies. Supply caches had to be established along the ambush route, escape routes planned and prepared, and contingency plans developed for every possible Roman response. The Germanic tribes had never attempted anything approaching this level of military organization, but under Arminius's guidance, they began to function with a unity and purpose that would have impressed even Roman strategists. As summer turned to autumn in the year 9 CE, Arminius judged that his preparations were complete. The tribal coalition was in place, the ambush sites prepared, and his own position with Varus remained secure. Now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation, the moment when he would need to convince the Roman governor to abandon his fortified positions and march his legions directly into the trap. The deception had to be perfect, believable enough to overcome any natural Roman caution, while urgent enough to prompt immediate action. Arminius approached Varus with disturbing news from the northern territories. A significant rebellion had erupted among the tribes beyond the Weser River, he reported, with chieftains who had previously submitted to Roman authority now openly defying imperial commands. Villages loyal to Rome were under attack, trade routes had been cut, and Roman citizens were in danger. The situation demanded immediate military intervention before the uprising could spread to other tribes and spiral completely out of control. To Varus, the report seemed entirely plausible. Germanic tribes were notoriously volatile, their allegiance to Rome often fragile, and subject to the whims of ambitious chieftains seeking to enhance their own prestige through acts of defiance. Similar uprisings had occurred throughout the conquered territories, and the standard Roman response had always been swift and decisive military action. The governor saw no reason to doubt his trusted auxiliary commander, whose knowledge of tribal politics and local conditions had proven invaluable in maintaining order throughout the province. What made the deception even more convincing was Arminius's apparent reluctance to lead Roman forces against his own people. He expressed genuine anguish at the necessity of suppressing Germanic rebels, lamenting the waste of life that would result and hoping that a show of Roman force might convince the insurgents to surrender without bloodshed. This emotional display perfectly matched Roman expectations of how a civilized Germanic leader should react to tribal violence, reinforcing Varus's confidence in his subordinates' loyalty and reliability. Other Roman officers received their own versions of the intelligence, carefully crafted to support the overall narrative, while appealing to their individual concerns and prejudices. Some heard reports of attacks on Roman merchants, others learned of threats to tribute collection. Still others received warnings about potential alliances between hostile tribes. Each piece of information seemed to confirm the others, creating a comprehensive picture of brewing rebellion that demanded immediate attention. Not everyone was convinced by these reports. Several Germanic chieftains who had remained loyal to Rome approached Varus with warnings about Arminius's true intentions. They spoke of secret meetings in forest clearings, of weapons being cached along remote trails, of warriors from distant tribes gathering in unprecedented numbers. Some even named Arminius directly as the architect of a conspiracy against Roman rule, urging the governor to arrest him immediately and investigate the supposed rebellion more carefully before committing his legions to action. Varus dismissed these warnings with the casual arrogance that had characterized Roman attitudes toward Germanic peoples throughout the conquest. The chieftains bringing these reports were obviously motivated by jealousy of Arminius's success and influence, he reasoned, seeking to undermine a rival through false accusations. Their stories were too fantastic to believe, too dependent on rumors and speculation to justify serious consideration. The idea that a Roman citizen and auxiliary commander would orchestrate such an elaborate betrayal seemed absurd to a man who had spent his career managing the complexities of imperial administration. This fatal blindness to the possibility of sophisticated Germanic resistance reflected broader Roman assumptions about barbarian capabilities. In the Roman worldview, tribal peoples were inherently incapable of the long-term planning and organizational discipline required for complex military operations. They might stage raids or mount desperate charges, but they lacked the intellectual capacity and cultural sophistication necessary to conceive and execute strategic deceptions. The very notion that Arminius could orchestrate a conspiracy involving multiple tribes across vast distances struck Roman officers as fundamentally implausible. As September drew to a close, Varus made his fateful decision. He would personally lead a major expedition into northern Germania to suppress the reported rebellion and restore order to the troubled region. 3 full legions would accompany him, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with 6 cohorts of auxiliary troops and 3 units of cavalry. The force would number approximately 20,000 soldiers, plus an additional 5,000 camp followers, supply personnel, and civilians who had attached themselves to the column for protection during the dangerous journey through hostile territory. The legions chosen for this expedition represented the cream of the Roman military establishment. The 17th Legion had earned glory in Augustus's Cantabrian campaigns. The 18th had distinguished itself in the conquest of Rhaetia, and the 19th bore battle honors from conflicts across Gaul and Germania. Their ranks included veterans who had served in dozens of campaigns, centurions whose tactical expertise had been honed through years of frontier warfare, and junior officers who represented the next generation of Roman military leadership. These were not raw recruits but seasoned professionals who had proven themselves in battle after battle. Supporting the legions were carefully selected auxiliary units drawn from across the empire. Germanic cavalry provided reconnaissance and screening capabilities, while Gallic infantry offered expertise in forest warfare that might prove valuable in the dense woodlands of northern Germania. Spanish slingers and Balearic archers added ranged striking power to complement the legionaries' close combat effectiveness. Each unit brought its own specialized skills and equipment, creating a combined force that seemed capable of handling any conceivable threat. The column that prepared to depart from its base camps along the Rhine was an impressive sight to behold. Polished armor glinted in the autumn sunlight as thousands of soldiers formed up in perfect ranks, their standards and banners creating a forest of silken metal above the marching formations. Supply wagons stretched for miles, loaded with everything necessary to sustain the expedition during its journey into the Germanic interior. The sound of marching feet, creaking leather, and jingling mail created a rhythmic symphony that spoke of Roman power and organization at its finest. Yet beneath this magnificent display of military might lay a fundamental vulnerability that Arminius understood better than any Roman commander. The very qualities that made Roman legions so formidable in open battle would become fatal weaknesses in the terrain he had chosen for his ambush. The disciplined formations that could shatter barbarian charges on level ground would prove impossible to maintain in dense forest. The heavy equipment that intimidated enemies across the empire would slow the column to a crawl on narrow woodland paths. The supply train that sustained Roman operations over vast distances would become, and for a moment, cause enormous liability when attacked. As the expedition began its march northward from the Rhine fortifications, Arminius rode alongside Varus at the head of the column, playing his role as loyal auxiliary commander to perfection. He provided detailed intelligence about the route ahead, pointing out landmarks and explaining local customs with the expertise expected of a native guide. His manner remained respectful but confident, that of a Roman officer proud to serve the empire while maintaining affection for his Germanic homeland. Nothing in his behavior suggested the slightest hint of treachery or duplicity. The journey began through relatively open country, where Roman patrols had established secure corridors between their fortified positions. The legions made good progress along well-maintained roads, their formations intact and their spirits high. Veterans shared stories of previous campaigns, while newer recruits marveled at the efficiency of Roman military organization. Officers conducted regular inspections, ensuring that equipment remained in perfect condition and that discipline was maintained throughout the ranks. But as the column moved deeper into Germanic territory, the landscape began to change in ominous ways. The broad roads gave way to narrow tracks winding between ancient trees. Rolling farmland was replaced by dense woodland, where visibility extended only a few dozen yards in any direction. The cheerful chatter of marching soldiers gradually died away as the forest closed around them like a living tomb, its shadows growing deeper with each passing mile. Arminius had chosen his route with diabolical precision. The path led inexorably toward a region known to Romans as the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, the Teutoburg Pass, though its name should more accurately be translated as the Teutoburg Narrows. Here the terrain formed a natural bottleneck between the Kalkriese hill to the south and the Great Bog to the north, creating a passage barely 200 meters wide, where an entire army would be compressed into a vulnerable column. The Kalkriese hill itself rose only 157 meters above the surrounding country, but its northern slope was cut by numerous brooks and rivulets that made passage treacherous for heavily laden troops. Dense woodland covered the hillsides, providing perfect concealment for thousands of warriors while limiting Roman visibility to mere yards in any direction. The boggy ground to the north was impassable for organized formations, effectively channeling the Roman column along the single viable route where Arminius had positioned his forces. For 3 days, Germanic warriors had been moving into position throughout this deadly corridor. They came not as a single army but as hundreds of small bands, each intimately familiar with their assigned section of forest. Cherusci fighters occupied positions near the entrance to the pass, ready to seal off any retreat once the Romans had committed themselves to the narrow path. Bructeri and Marsi warriors spread themselves along the hillsides, their weapons cached in hidden locations that would allow them to strike and fade back into the woods. Chatty spearmen positioned themselves near the far end of the passage, prepared to block any attempt at escape. The coordination required for this deployment was unprecedented in Germanic military history. Traditional tribal warfare relied on individual courage and spontaneous attacks, but Arminius had imposed Roman-style discipline on his barbarian allies. Each warrior knew his exact position, his specific role in the coming battle, and the signals that would coordinate their attacks. Supply caches had been established throughout the forest, ensuring that ammunition and fresh weapons would be available during the extended fighting that lay ahead. As the Roman column approached the Narrows on the morning of the ambush, Arminius made his final preparations for betrayal. He sent trusted messengers ahead to confirm that all tribal contingents were in position and ready to attack on his signal. He reviewed escape routes one last time, ensuring that he could slip away from the Roman command group when the fighting began. Most importantly, he steeled himself for the moment when he would shed his Roman identity forever and reclaim his birthright as a Germanic chieftain. The weather that morning seemed to conspire against the Romans. Grey clouds gathered overhead, promising the kind of steady rain that would turn forest paths into muddy quagmires and make footing treacherous for heavily armored soldiers. The air hung thick and oppressive, muffling sounds and reducing visibility even further. Horses grew nervous, the tension and skittish, sensing that permeated the woodland despite their riders' apparent confidence. As the lead elements of the Roman column entered the Narrows, Arminius gave his signal. The sound began as a low horn call echoing from the depths of the forest, answered by similar calls from positions throughout the pass. To Roman ears, these might have seemed like hunting horns or tribal ceremonial music, but they carried a message of deadly intent to the thousands of warriors hidden among the trees. The first attacks came not as a coordinated assault, but as scattered strikes against the Roman supply train. Individual warriors darted from concealment to hurl javelins at pack animals and wagon drivers before melting back into the forest. These initial strikes seemed like opportunistic raids by bandits seeking easy plunder, the kind of minor harassment that Roman columns had learned to expect when traveling through hostile territory. But the attacks quickly intensified and spread along the entire length of the column. What had seemed like random bandit activity revealed itself as the opening phase of a carefully orchestrated massacre. Germanic warriors emerged from every shadow, their war cries echoing through the forest as they fell upon the struggling Roman formations. The narrow confines of the pass made it impossible for the legions to deploy into their traditional battle lines, reducing centuries and cohorts to isolated groups fighting desperately for survival. The Romans found themselves caught in a nightmare scenario that negated every tactical advantage they possessed. Their heavy shields, designed to interlock in close formation, became individual burdens when soldiers could not maintain ranks. Their throwing spears, devastating when launched in coordinated volleys, were reduced to close combat weapons in the cramped conditions of forest fighting. Their armor, which provided excellent protection against frontal attacks, left them vulnerable to strikes from above as Germanic warriors rained missiles down from the hillsides. For the barbarian fighters, this was warfare as their ancestors had practiced it for generations. Lightly armed and intimately familiar with forest terrain, they struck with lightning speed before vanishing into thickets where Roman pursuit was impossible. Their oval shields and long spears were perfectly suited for individual combat, while their knowledge of every tree and stone in the ambush zone gave them overwhelming tactical advantage over the confused and disoriented legionaries. The Teutoburg forest stands as eternal testimony to the price of arrogance and the power of cunning over brute force. Arminius had achieved what no Germanic leader before him had dared imagine, transforming Rome's greatest strength into its fatal weakness and proving that even the mightiest empire could bleed. The forest that witnessed this massacre would forever echo with the ghosts of 20,000 Roman dead and the birth of a free Germania that Rome would never again dare to claim.